Good morning, everyone. I'm Trish Triumpho Sullivan, and we're going to talk about ISO or film speed. So this lecture for Photo 1 is about the ISO on your camera. Let's get started. So the ISO is one of three controls on your camera. Okay, the three controls on your camera that affect exposure. So the three controls right? Remember, exposure is another term for your photograph or your image that you create when you take a picture, okay? So exposure is something we talk about quite a bit, but it also means how much light comes into your camera. So remember, you can have overexposed, right? You can have correct exposure, and you can have underexposed. Right? We talk about that a lot. So over, under. So that just talks about how much light's coming in your camera. This is too much, right? If it's overexposed, there's too much light coming in. Correct exposure, it's just right? Just like Goldilocks. Too much, too little, just right. So it's the Goldilocks right there, correct? And of course, underexposed is not enough light and your photograph is too dark or your exposure is too dark. So the three controls that affect exposure on your camera are the first two that we've talked about extensively, right? Your aperture. Remember, aperture is your little window. Right? Your shutter. Remember, the shutter is like your curtain. Curtain covers the window and opens and closes. And the final thing that affects depth of field is your ISO. Okay. The ISO is the film sensitivity to light. Okay, so that's what this is. That's what this control is. Film or sensor, right? Because if you have a digital camera, you're going to have a sensor, not film. So it's your film or sensor. I'll write it up here. Sensitivity to light. Okay? So these three controls, the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO, are the only three controls that affect exposure. That means how much light. Right? Exposure is how much light comes into your camera. So that's exposure. It's how much light. Now we learned that the aperture can get very small or very large from our first assignments, right? We learned that we can change the size of the aperture and have more or less light coming in. We can change the speed of the shutter, right? Because this is size, this is amount of light, right? And this is the time, right? How long the shutter stays open. So it's shutter speed, right? We call it shutter speed because the shutter can be very fast or very slow, right? And then finally, we have the ISO, which basically describes how sensitive your film or your sensor is to light. And this can help you when you're trying to adjust for more extreme conditions, especially if you're using a digital camera, right? Back in the old days, if you wanted to photograph in a different condition, you would need to change your film. So in other words, if you wanted to be out in the really bright sunshine, say at the beach or out on the lake in the water with a lot of bright sunshine and reflection, because, or even in the snow, right? Then you might need to change your film or your ISO sensitivity setting to compensate for that extreme brightness. Same is true if you had extreme darkness. You want to photograph at night. You might want to change your ISO setting to make it more sensitive, or less sensitive, I should say, more sensitive to light. Excuse me, so that you can better adapt that Sunny 16 rule to your lighting conditions. Okay, so if you were just using a digital camera, you would just change that. So let's talk a little bit more about your ISO. So the ISO stands for, right, of course it stands for something, right? So the ISO stands for International Standards Organization. Okay, so we have the International Standards Organization. So no matter where you go in the world or what kind of camera you get, ISO controls remain exactly the same. Okay, they're always going to be those same numbers. There's no difference wherever you go or whatever kind of camera you have. If you have an old camera, some of you may be borrowing or have found an old film camera, you might notice that it says ASA. ASA is the exact same thing as ISO, right? There's no difference. This one is no longer used in cameras because they came out with the International Standards Organization. ASA stands for American Standards Association. So this would be an old camera. You might see that. And if you had an old camera that was from Europe, you might see this instead. It might say DIN. Okay, so that is German for standard, whatever standards organization. I'm sure it's Deutsch something or other, right? And of course I don't speak German, so I can't really help you there. But these are the same thing as the ISO, right? It's the exact same thing. If you see a camera that has ASA or DIN, it means ISO, which is International Standards Organization, and it means that the ISO stays the same no matter what kind of camera you buy, whether it's an old camera that you end up coming across or a modern one. You know the ISO just stands for International Standards Organization, and it means that they're all the same. Okay, so let's talk about the ISO quickly. So the ISO, remember, one of the controls that controls exposure, one of the three controls on your camera that control exposure, the ISO describes your film or sensors, it's digital, just describes your film or your sensors sensitivity to light. Okay, that's all it is. It's just how sensitive the film is to light. And guess what? Like everything in photography, it's represented by numbers, right? Sometimes you'll hear people call this the film speed. But film doesn't really have a speed, right? It's not like a shutter that has a timed open and closing. It's not necessarily fast or slow. However, guess what? People describe it as fast or slow, okay? So you'll often hear someone say the film speed, which really isn't true. The film doesn't really have a speed. This is basically your film or sensor's sensitivity to light. Just remember, ISO is how sensitive your film or your sensor is to light. So those numbers Well, could be like something like this. You'd have 25, 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, okay? And those numbers represent how sensitive your film is to light, okay? This would be considered over here, would call this slow film, right? And this would be considered fast film. Right here, 200 to 400, we would consider medium. And that's why in this class, we're using a 200 ISO on our cameras. I'm asking everyone to set your camera permanently at 200 ISO to make it easier to learn the Sunny 16 rule or basic daylight exposure like we've talked about in our previous lectures. It's easier to learn, I think, if you're not all confused with more numbers to deal with, okay? So this would be considered slow film. This would be used in very bright lighting conditions. Like super bright, okay? These would be used in very dark conditions, right? Like maybe nighttime. So super bright, think about what could be super bright. Well, how about the beach, right? You've got sand, you've got water, and they all reflect. The beach could be super bright. You could be out on the lake, right? Where you've got water reflecting sun. If it's a sunny day, it could be super bright, okay? Or another place where it could be super bright, snow, because you've got lots of white reflecting that sunlight back. And so, you know, you can get, it could be super, super bright. These are the conditions where you might want to use what we call a slow film, right? Because this film is very, it's not as sensitive to light. So it's better for taking these really bright pictures like at the beach, the lake, or the snow. So if you're out in those conditions, you might consider using a very slow ISO. Can also be used for objects that aren't moving, okay? This is what we've been using because this is like probably the most versatile, right? 200 to 400, it's most versatile, and you can use it for pretty much any condition. Okay. This film, what would be dark conditions? Well, dark conditions might be nighttime, right? Could be indoors, could be really dark. Sometimes indoors, even in the daytime, is really dark depending on how many windows or how much light is in the room, right? Candlelight. And those would be considered really dark conditions. So nighttime could be either photographing the sky or photographing a night scene like a ball game or a street scene like say in downtown, right, where you have some light but it's dark, right? It's nighttime. So obviously the sun's not out. When the sun's not out, it's dark, right? And as everything else, we need light for our cameras to see, just like we need light for our eyes to see. So how did they get these terms slow and fast? Well, when this type of film was invented to use in dark situations, the guy that invented it actually thought that he was inventing film to use for fast moving objects. So he thought that he could invent a film that would work good for things that were moving fast. Well, it didn't really end up working out that way because it's not that great for filming things that are moving fast, but it's great for dark lighting conditions, okay? So dark lighting conditions, boom, it's good. And then this type of film is good for, like I said, bright conditions or objects that aren't moving, so that you can have you have time to have a long exposure if needed. So So that's where you get this thing called, where you hear people say film speed, right? Because they're saying originally originally this was invented to use for fast moving objects, okay? And there's a pretty fun story about Edward Muybridge and Leland Stanford. Stanford was one of the first governors of California, and heck, I think he was the first governor maybe of California when we became a state, and also the founder of Stanford University, right? And he had a job for that he wanted to prove that horses could fly, and so he commissioned this photographer by the name of Edward Muybridge, and we're gonna see some film about him. And he basically set up a bank of cameras with trip wires. So when the horse would run past, it would trip a wire and make an exposure on each camera. And by doing that, he was able to freeze motion, right, on this horse, and prove that at one point during galloping, all 4 hooves, all 4 feet of the horse were up off the ground. And so in this, it was actually to win a bet with his friend, right? Leland Stanford had a bet that horses could fly. And so he was bound and determined to win that bet. So he actually hired a photographer who spent like years doing this project to prove that horses could fly. So Edward Muybridge and Leland Stanford are the ones that proved horses could fly, and Edward Muybridge is one of the reasons that we actually have moving pictures right now. So that's kind of a fun little side. That's Muybridge is the guy's last name. Right. Edward Muybridge. And then Leland Stanford. Okay, so that's fun little side story. So these